Hello and welcome to the last edition of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium of 2021. What a year it's been. Today we have the presentation topic titled Oscillating Between Images of Futures and Technology, a Latin American Adventure. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence. And I'm also the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective. And what a year it's been. Far and wide throughout the globe, in various positions and in various contexts, from industry, from government, from academe, you name it. We've had a lot of people come onto the program and share with us their adventures. In recap, William DeBars, Matt Mitka, Giselle Waters, Ronald Klein, Diane Martin, Herman Tavani, Jeremy Pitt, Susie Josie Featherston, Diana Aiton-Schenker, Raphael Capuro, Mark Hurst, Emma Froh, Reese Farthing, Rebecca Herold, Jordan Miller, Jumana Abugazela, and a lot more. We've learned so much about public interest technology, how to design systems in the hope that we're actually serving the public interest and sustainability, both of the person, the human, and the planet. Our last act is a visitor who has been with us once before in the first ever series. I think it was issue number 3. And his name is Martin Comeso Perez. He's one of our most enthusiastic students in the HSD, the Human and Social Dimensions PhD program at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. About Martin, I can say a lot. Probably one of the first people I ever met at SFIS at ASU, and was quickly enamored by his charm and his excellence. He heralds from Chile and completed a Bachelor in Chemistry from the University of Chile in 2010, following on somehow a quick diploma in quality management and leadership, and that shines through in all of Martin's work, and a master's in chemistry before embarking on his PhD on scholarship. He's also an ASU sessional faculty, which means he teaches into the school, the Global Technology Development Program at master's level, teaching in his specialization of Latin America and tech and development, and a myriad of special topics, both at the 400 and 500 levels. So he has great experience teaching last year undergraduates and also master's students, as well as some PhD topics. He's had widespread conference participation and presentation in oral form and written, in Chile, in Argentina, in Spain, and of course the US. And in reading his bio more deeply, I was intrigued in 2 values that he self-identifies with. That's the value of responsibility and commitment. And for anyone who knows this young man, we all know he is utterly responsible, whether it's been in chaperoning classes, for example, in guiding people through the building of a solar spell device under the auspices of Laura Hossman, through to commitment, seeing things through. And he's always juggling at least 5,000 things at once, but that's part of the amazingness of this individual. A short Google search, or a quick Google search, I should say, brings up this happy, amazing, smiling character that you want to know more about, whether it's at 4S, at hashtag, winning awards in the school, or beyond the school. You can see how much Martin has played a huge role in people's lives. He's always with others, celebrating others, helping others, committing to others. And today we have the amazing joy of listening to him. So I pass on now to one of his peers, Salah Hamdoun, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Katina. Congratulations, everyone. This is the last talk of the series, and it's been just an amazing journey. I'm absolutely honored to be here on the stage with Martin. I've gotten to know him as a mentor from the first moment that I joined the PhD program at Arizona State University. As you mentioned, Martin is a fifth-year Chilean PhD student. He's passionate about empowering people to navigate through the social technical systems. His studies are absolutely transdisciplinary. And he identifies himself also as a transdisciplinary scholar. That's why I'm really excited about this specific talk. Every time we speak with Martin is a moment of learning. And it's been like that not only for me, but for everyone he encounters. It is a communication of care, love for the topic, and I'm expecting nothing less today. I'm very excited about this talk, and again, as I said, very honored. Martin, today we'll be talking about the topic will be oscillating between images of the futures and technology, a Latin American adventure. His perspective is going to be very valuable, and I can't wait to listen to him, and I will stop talking right now. Thank you again, Martin, for joining us, and I will give you the floor. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. I deeply honor for the introduction of Katina and Salah today. And I'm really happy to share part of like my ongoing research project that is part of my dissertation project. Thanks, Katina, for highlighting my teaching trajectory. I came to a PhD, and I'm still in a PhD because I have a deeply commitment with education, and I'm really motivated to learn more constantly from not just from books and articles, but also from people to share with others not just ideas that can change the world, but also the skills to navigate the uncertainty and complexities that will lay everyday life. And today I want to share about what is part of my dissertation, but it's also part of like an ongoing project that Salah wonderfully introduced. It's called for today, Oscillating Between Images of the Future and Images of Technology. I will hopefully activate the full screen. Can you see the full screen and the automatic transcription below?
Yes.
Fantastic. If like somebody has any issue, hopefully the transcription below will help me to articulate better the ideas that I'm saying, but are not as clear for my accent or for the speed of my speech. Today I want to talk about something that I'm deeply intrigued, something that like has been me hook in part since I started in SFIS, my PhD program, but also more recently, like starting last fall, I decided this will be my dissertation project to get my PhD. And it's, what is the relationship we have between futures and technology? And in particular, how that relationship looks like on Latin America. And this first image is a screenshot from a video from 2015 called Ibrality from the Japanese creator Keiichi Matsuda. But how this video is relevant for the notion of Latin America. If you pick a little more attention, this like very messy urban setting has, in addition to like a big cat or like layers of holographic information, you can read in the site like Bancolombia and other elements that you can start to recognize if you have ever visited Colombia. Because this video is in a Colombian city in the future, until the history of a woman that started to be hacked on an apparent device that helped her to understand the reality with this like extra layer that is called Ibrality, and how this hacking affects deeply her identity in a moment of struggling. and how different institutions and mundane devices, like going to the supermarket, taking public transport, or asking for help, result to be translated by this extra layer of technology. And this image has a lot to do with how we envision some futures, where digital technologies take even more importance in our everyday life, and not just in the highly populated centers of industrialized countries, but also in more peripheral places, like this city in Colombia, in which the economy is mostly based on services, and the relationships are still with multiple layers of inequality. Ibrality, in its 8 minutes, tell us an history about how a possible future can be destroyed for very specific tools that we have today, like hacking and glitching devices. And from a perspective of public interest technology, it's particularly important to reflect not just on how socio-technical systems of today are making damage, but how the designs that we are making in the future might affect peripheral communities, and not just the ones that are surrounding the places of development and programming that are currently in question. When we talk about the relationship between future and technology, we shouldn't just see what is going on in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen in China, but also what is going on in the rest of the world. And with that question, on this overall question, why the relationship between future and technology is so frequently entangled, I'm gonna start to explore how we understand and operate with futures and technology, and how we can identify those two elements. In this conversation, and I had the chance to, in this second cycle, participate a lot in different seminars. There was, I will say, two kind of presentations, and I will try to bring both in my session today. Ones were highly conceptual experiences that were reflecting on the challenge of the contemporary world, but others that were deeply intimate and sincere reflections about life and in different dimensions. And me as a young scholar, confronting and trying to build theory with little experience on research that I'm developing during my PhD, it is highly challenging, but also is highly motivating. It's highly motivating to try to make sense of things that a lot of people give for granted. And I think from my transdisciplinary training, or also the reason why my PhD program, Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology, exists, is to question those assumptions. And I deeply intrigued, not just for the meanings of this relationship between the idea of future and the idea of technology from an academic point of view, but also in how we relate later with political concepts like development, growth, or change. And those elements that are often discussed in the political discourse and in the public discourse tend to bring this entanglement with them too. And from that reason, I started to explore these two big concepts in a more nuanced and grabbable way that I will call visions or images. And I will use these concepts undistinguishably during the presentation. But more often, I will refer to images of the future and visions of technology to try to make it a little more easy to differentiate each other, because that is what I'm trying to do, is try to identify these two elements and how we can work with both. But visions are usually not just pictorial illustrations that as what most people with the capability to see, we will quickly associate. But also visions or images in academia can also be discursive and metaphorical representation of possible realities. In that way, not necessarily to be in the future, but can be in other places in time or space. And these images result and work as epistemic and situated artifacts. That means that we're created in a specific place and time and convey a specific ways of knowing. Not all images means the same for all communities, and for a reason are fascinating to study. And often there is like technological elements refer on those images that usually get neglected for the analyst. And we talk about like the possibilities or the desirability of the future or how feasible can be, but not as much about what beliefs there are, in particular about technology, because we give it for granted. Berka 2006 has found like different roles that in innovation systems visions might play, like map possibilities of a space, be an heuristic device for specific problems, enable the identification of stable frames to monitoring something, and say like we want to arrive here and go in this way. Can also be specific metaphors or narratives for create identity in groups, and that is particularly powerful, not just in a national level, but in an organizational and identitarian level. And finally, bring together different networks and capital. And in that one, the last one, I think, is the principal function that I'm trying to dissect. The concept of image of the future, it has its own history. It came from a book from 1961 from Frederick Pollack, which researched the relationship between futures and development and make an historical revision to observe how different societies that might have positive images of the future in a specific moment were able to rise from a specific cultural context and survive and like thrive. Meanwhile, those societies that were like dominant, the dominant conversations were like declining images of the future, their development also were staggered. And Pollack made this analysis in a mix between like revision of history with like some anthropological evidence, with a lot of religious discourse. But this hypothesis, despite it is controversial and haven't been like totally proved, has been driving a lot of assumptions that the field of future studies has had until now, as well how the relationship between future technology and society can work in a specific way. I'm trying to go deeper in that assumption, in particular for the case of Latin American countries. The concept of image of the future, in the way we can be summarized in today, a different representation of the collective state of things, of a society as a whole, in all aspects into the future. And this is a definition of like another young researcher, Alessandro Fergnani. And usually for images of the future, we collect signals that are little elements or hints that like the present can give us to say that like something is changing. We can also like get expert perspectives, develop scenarios with different methods that exist for that. And images of the future can be individual or collective, given a specific time and place. This is important because it will help us to identify different scales of images of the future. For other part, we have visions of technology. They are a way of thinking and represent socio-technical systems. And different images of the future, visions of technology tends to be highly flexible and unstable and provisional. And sometimes we can find that images of technologies are reductionist about what a technology can be. That means like we usually refer artifacts and actually emerging technology artifacts, neglecting present technologies around us, as well what can be the impacts and functions of a technology. And in that way, vision of technology, I like to refer, if we think that any artifact and any technology, even like social technology, like the justice system or the healthcare system, are networks of people and things connected together in different layers, an individual, a person, need to be in some place of that system. And from that place, we'll be able to see one specific set of elements of the sociotechnical systems and ignore others, as well the relationship that those elements have. And I like to describe visions of technology. If we have like this network of things, like imagine like a bag full of elements, like an imprint that you take from any side of this bag full of elements. And despite the technology will be the same, the information that like that person will have access to understand and describe that technology will be given for that position on the system. And for a reason, visions of technology, we tend to refer with the same word, different visions. And that for me is part of this fascinating issue, because images of the future tell us like how things will change, but like in the same group of people will have some kind of different visions of technology that will be related to how that person is and what is their profession and how much insight have about that sociotechnical system in particular. And why is this very important? Because that tells us to not just assume that when we talk about genetic modification or surveillance digital devices and algorithms that we are exposed, we just not just assume that everybody is understanding the same as us in the same form. And this has its own implications for ethics, but like in my case, I'm really interested on the implications on future making. There is like a third concept that is associated with these two previous ones that came from science and technology studies that was proposed for Jasanoff and Kim in 2009. And that is the concept of sociotechnical imaginaries. And sociotechnical imaginaries are generally future-oriented visions of connected social and technological orders with more or less determinism built into them. This is important because this notion has been like popularized in the last decade on the field that I base my PhD, but also is different to these other two. First, because it doesn't assume that these imaginaries can be like multiple as the visions of technology, and that lack of multiplicity is because sociotechnical imaginaries must be collectively institutionalized and publicly performed. Instead, visions of technology can be individual, change over time, and also acknowledge the pluriversal or like multiple nature of that the elements have in them. And this is very, very important because in some form, images of the future have this scale, and sociotechnical imaginaries will be like in a high, rigid space, and visions of technology will be in our everyday life. And I'm very interested in this specific, more lower level, that individuals and their like more close communities are interacting through their conversations, through media, through the specific organizational conversations that are like modeling these sociotechnical imaginaries that are more like public, collective, and institutionalized. And in that way, these visions of technology are happening multiple of them at the same time, and are affecting these different visions of the future. In summary, the image of the future will always refer to something beyond the present, will incorporate some degree of uncertainty and speculation. And despite there's like multiple structural forms, like the screenshot that I showed at the beginning, as well descriptions of some of the, I will be sharing in the next part of the presentation. An image of the future might refer to some dominant patterns of change. And we can find different kind of like archetypes, like as Frederick Pollack was like looking for, of rising cultures or declining cultures or staggering culture of transformations of culture, achieved that are described as 4 archetypes, but different scholars in futures studies and in organizational studies identify other collections of archetypes for images of the future. Nevertheless, those archetypes of visions of the future doesn't tell us how they think about technology or visions of technology, despite their carrying them. And that is what I'm particularly researching on. As I say, visions of the future has like multiple layers. And this is a famous representation on futures that is called the Boros cone, that tell us that from the present, we start to project different things. And in this one, even there is like layers of like a projected future, that's like how the present will move to the future. And like usually what somebody extrapolate what it will be the next year, the next 10 years from now. And we can talk, for instance, how impactful will be still COVID, because we're still living a pandemic time. But we don't know if we will get other catastrophes or other big changes in our societies that will make COVID a less important factor in our conversations about the future. There is the relationship about like what is plausible, or like what can happen with current knowledge that we have. And this gives a space to some disruptions that can happen in the future, and that is a role of innovation, as well as structural, political, and cultural changes that we also have seen in the last years with the revival of right-wing governments, or the immigration crisis, or the climate change, that help us to envision what can happen in our future. And then what is preferable future is what, like, particularly future studies practitioners are interested to work on individual and organizational levels. But that preferability doesn't talk also about what is the role of technology. And that means with all the things I have been saying, it's like that is what I will try to explore in some cases. To like we separate light with a polarizer to get the different waves, to separate in our analysis from an image of the future, what are the technological elements that are in there. And this will help us to not just reflect critically about the consequences of the technologies, but also to reflect critically about the possibilities that futures that we discuss as desirable might entail in their feasibility, their ethics, and their possibilities. I will start with like an example of this, and this is the notion of robots. When we talk about robots, we tend to envision a humanoid machine. The notion of robot actually just had 100 years and came from like a very fascinating play from Karel Capek, a Czech a screenwriter, playwriter, sorry. And came, the concept of robot means in some translation of Czech slave. It means there's like a strong relationship from the beginning of this word between labor and labor and machines. But at the same time, that image of robots that we have about this like mechanic humanoid is very different to the two things that you can see in here. The first one is like this specific, this specific totem that is like a supermarket robot that has been implemented in Mexico and Chile for helping with the supermarket work. And the second one is an agricultural robot that looks more like a tractor than other thing that is helping farmers in Argentina with their crops. These both robots are very different. First, about what we expect to a robot to be doing, and second, how the robot look like. And that makes that the image of the future that we have about robots versus the image of technology, that how the robots actually work and what robots can do actually in these times in 2021. It's a very disjoint image. And unless people is working or connected with people in robotics, we are not envision that robots can be like this, but like we can envision a robot like this one, and the bottom, that a Roomba or a domestic robot. And this is like probably what is more available in the public conversations about like what robots are doing today. Nevertheless, the large majority of robots in the world in this moment are being used by industrialized countries in their industrial processes. The car industry is one of the first one that was like automated in the last 30 years. And from there, a lot of other industries have developed mechanisms to automate their processes. But the automation by robots is different to the automation that we can see in a product line. And in that way, that difference of intelligence and automation has been matter of discussion about like what robots can do or not. But coming back to this domestic robot is fascinating because came from a very specific imagination from different shows in the 50s and 60s, talking about automating houses and domotics. And one popular metaphor image is the servant from the Jetson, a popular TV show for kids in that time. But this robot does a similar work, like take care of and cleans the house constantly. But also that robot can come with some cautionary tales. And in I think the right side from you will see also this like kind of like cube with like a red light. That actually is also a representation of like a future like vacuum cleaner, robot vacuum cleaner. But this came from a show that this episode from 2021 from a show in Netflix called Dead, Sex and Robots. And it's short animation histories. And in this one, the robot that also science fiction has associated with like histories like Terminator as a risk for humanity is given that kind of behavior, a kind of like threatening behavior, this robot vacuum cleaner, reinforcing an imagination about like robots can be a risk for humans if they go on control or they do whatever they want. And this is fascinating between what are the fears and the imaginations that we have about the future and the relationship with robots for humans, and what are the or level of discussions about what might happen, versus what actually robots are these totems or distractors or these vacuum cleaners that are very limited in their functions and capabilities, but we constantly are discussing with this like image of technology of this automated human, automated mechanic, human-like artifact. The advances in artificial intelligence also had make very rapid growing of the robotic industry in the last year, but we are like still far to get this kind of devices, humanistic devices, other than specific experiments from organizations. From there, when we talk about these two things, visions of technology and visions of the future, I will bring to the ideas of Donna Haraway, the philosopher, and about situations, because not all places will have the same robot, and they currently don't have it. But our visions about what a robot might have and what a robot might do seems to be shared around different cultures and societies. And that has to do because we exchange visions of technology in different medias, not just from what the government say or what we learn in school, but also from popular media, from newspapers, from non-fiction books, and talks like this one. And at the same time, we have the reality saying us what are the possibilities of the words. And if we embrace that in each technology, there is like a set of multiple possibilities, we start to find that the different deployments of socio-technical systems, like the robots, will create a multiplicity of interpretations for that societies, as well a multiplicity of possible futures that might come. And that is what is called, for different authors, starting for Arturo Escobar, Marisol del Cadena, or Roberto Fleiser, pluriverse, that refers to these multiple ontologies that came from the systems that we have for the future. In that way, the problem of talking about images of the future and images of technology became not just a problem about specific artifacts and the analysis of their possibilities, but also about the ramifications that futures and technology might produce. In that way, other scholars have been like starting to explore those ramifications. And Fisher and Merher, in a recent article called Building Possible Worlds, to start to create a way to reflect about just images of the future, they observe that the role of socio-technical imaginaries and discourse surrounding the understanding of futures, it's based always on like what the present have to understand and see. And we create futures today, and we discuss about the future today. And that futures can be like what we'll do after COVID, as well, like what we'll like do on the holidays with your families. But we do that in process of envisioning to make decision making today. And that can be in an explicit or implicit manner, the way that we shape what future look like for us, and for us, or families, or organizations, or colleagues. But those futures also are related with the power relationships that are inscribed in the artifacts, the technical dispositives, practices, and discourses, as well as science and technology studies has shown us. In that way, these ramifications of futures are also ramifications of the ways of being and ways of knowing that we acknowledge in a specific moment or no. And extracting those ramifications, from those ramifications, what the sociotechnical systems might look like and what functions a society might have is particularly difficult, because talking about one specific technology or image of the future will connect with multiple possibilities, and exploring those multiple possibilities are the things that make very challenging the process of separate image of the future of images of technology. To make this work, I'm approaching it from a visual narrative analysis perspective, because I found that they do a fantastic job identifying the modality of expression of a specific thing, the grammar that is inscripted on the system, and that can be like a visual grammar, or like the grammar about like oral or written grammar that refers about like what role the future have and how explicit or implicit technologies are on the message, as well as the meaning. What are the set of possibilities that and interpretations that might happen from there, and that interpretation are this layer of possibilities embedded in one specific image. To also systematize this kind of interpretation, there is like different tools that came from technology studies or from future studies, like the McLuhan tetrad, that is like an exercise of like Marshall McLuhan media theories, ask 4 questions to any technology or system that appears around it to refer and reflect what that technology means in that specific place and time. Or also the pestle analysis, that it's a dimensional cue to reflect about different implications that one specific technology or future might have. Now, before moving to my next example, I want to make emphasis and bring the work of Arjun Polarization to make emphasis to the importance of future social practice. He says the image, the imagine, and the imaginary. These are terms that direct to us in some critical or new global cultural process. The imagination is a social practice because both things, the design of technologies and the possible uses and the interpretations of the uses, as well, the creation of images of the future, the organizational practices, and the potential decision making that we will do, both are related with the capabilities that people have to imagine their consequences of their acts and the consequences or the system that they're embedded. And in that way, imagination does not need to be reduced to be a fantasy or something that is performed just for experts or people in academia, but also need to be acknowledged that it's a capability that is embedded in all of us and is part of like our everyday life and work. And why this is important? Because acknowledging that everybody is doing their own imagining processes to think about the future and else envision what are the possibilities of technologies around them, makes that the discussion about futures and technology, it's also discussion about democratizing the capabilities that we have to make better worlds for us. And that is something that not need to be reduced to the work of scholars or also organizations that are like enforcing images of the future about, like, for instance, the metaverse, that has been one of the most popular recently, but also the ones that are happening in the places that we're not seeing. Because imagination is central to all form of agencies, Apaura says, and itself is a social fact, and is key component for new global orders. And if we think that the world that we are arriving is a world that we embrace the multiplicity of futures to make it for all, we need to acknowledge that everybody is part of that. There is, like, in UNESCO, a group of scholars and thinkers and practitioners that has been, like, since 2017, if I'm not missing it, working in the concept of futures literacy to describe part of this capability, but the capacity of imagining, the capacity of speculate, and the capacity of decision making are central to this future literacy, and how we empower people to reflect deeply on what futures might come, as well what are the consequences of the technologies on those futures. But something that we need to acknowledge is that those images that I have been describing until now are not equally produced, designed, or distributed. And different sources of images of the future and visions of technology have emerged, in particular in the last 30 years. Different communities seeing futures as a threat in space. Why? Because they are not part of those futures. They're not reflected on those images. They're not considered explicitly in those conversations, or they're not incorporated their ways of living, ways of knowing, or ways of doing on them. And in that way, have emerged fascinating projects like the African Futurism Project in response to the Afrofuturism creative wave. There is multiple indigenous futurisms, mostly in North America, but also has been different projects to decolonize the future in Asia, the Polynesia, and some places in Latin America. But something that also noted was, like, Latin America as a region is not part of this conversation. And that has to do with the lack of articulation that has, but also how future studies, despite being present for a long time in the region, have been deeply dependent on the work that scholars and thinkers in the global north have articulated the field. And that way there's, like, a kind of, like, precedence about, like, the people that works in future Latin America works doing futures like are done in the global north. And part of my research that is, like, for other part that I will not share today, but, like, part of the things I'm exploring is, like, how futurists are people that work in future creation on Latin America are doing that, and how they connect with their the region. To show an application of this relationship between futures and technology, and, like, starting to going to the last part of the presentation, I want to show another case that is the cashless society in El Salvador. El Salvador, during this year, as country, has decided to make Bitcoin a legal tender. This means that now, in addition to the national currency, Bitcoin must be accepted in all locals. This is fascinating because Bitcoin had a very short life, has, like, no more than 10 years of implementation. It's a very specific cryptocurrency, but is for sure the most popular one. And make El Salvador a pioneer on this has, like, advantage and disadvantage for the country. But the discussion until now has been a lot about how much economical effects will have this transition to be the first country in the world making Bitcoin a legal tender for El Salvador, but very little about, like, where are the technologies that make Bitcoin possible to be used in El Salvador. I mean, it's like make cashless society and also bring the possibilities of revenue that, like, Bitcoin might make for Central America is something that needs to be examined in a different perspective is a technological perspective. And why this is important? Because I will exemplify with in this image of the future of the cashless society of El Salvador, some relationships of the socio-technical system that will help us to understand why it's important to separate this. When we see how this has been implemented in the last 2-3 months, there has been a lot of conversations. The first one is about to use Bitcoin, you require to have devices that are able to make these transactions. And that has extended the use in all ages of smartphones or other devices that are able to make digital transactions and connect to the internet for personal use. This, despite in El Salvador, the penetration of these smartphones has been high in the last decade. The telecommunication infrastructure has its limitations, but the first relationship here, when this demand of smartphones increase, also the infrastructure of telecommunication increase, and this is a positive effect or agonistic effect between the image of technology and the image of the future of what have the Bitcoin country will require. But there is like a second element of the socio-technical system that is a little more problematic, because despite the access to the technology has been facilitated in recent years, the knowledge to use effectively this technology doesn't. And the rates of digital literacy among El Salvador are between 60 to 80% of different reports. That means with this implementation that happened during this year, there is between 20 to 40% of the population that is not prepared to operate properly with these devices. Despite having the device, despite having the connection, they have issues. And that is an agonistic effect from the digital literacy among the citizens of El Salvador. And why is this important? Because now the infrastructure is helping to the system to work, but the knowledge that requires that socio-technical system, it doesn't. And it's like between image of the future and image of technology, there is like positive and negative elements on the visions of technology, that what you require to have a network of Bitcoin operating in a country to make it happen. And also there is like a third kind of effect. And for this one, I will exemplify with the rural electricity infrastructures, because you can have the knowledge to use Bitcoin, you can have the device to use Bitcoin, you can have the telecommunication network and signal in there. But if your devices, in particular, if you're like a little entrepreneur or like a businessman in a farm in El Salvador, the electric infrastructure in El Salvador has like some issues of reliability on rural areas. That means those areas are not always with like available electricity, and that modify the relationship that rural areas have with Bitcoin versus urban areas. And that structural inequality that we characterize deeply affect a policy like that. And the imagination of a cashless country make a little more problematic depending where you are. And this modification that in some way creates gradients of implementation from the vision of the future to make the decision making to like enforce a specific reality that is that future that is possible and desirable in some perspective, has these modifications on that are, I call it like allosteric effects. And those allosteric effects are not directly to the things that we envision as like what you need for like run Bitcoin, but are central to make this network of cryptocurrency run around the country. This example tells us that when we ignore the technological dimensions or the technological visions that are entangled with the visions of the future, we might have usually technological shortcomings. The first of that is technological universalism, that like a solution that works in specific places can work in everywhere to solve the same issue. And perhaps Bitcoin was not the best option for El Salvador, and some other countries like China or Ecuador have been experimenting with digital cryptocurrencies for a while, but not enforcing it in the way that El Salvador is doing it, or the way that like is practiced in areas as the California Valley in the recent years. That universalism usually carries a technological determinism. That is this notion that like specific technologies can make a specific process of changes by themselves. And enforcing the use and practices and implementation of a technology doesn't entail that societal cultural change, because there is like an interaction, as we know, between culture and technologies. And because technologies are a manifestation of local cultures, and assume that like bringing or transforming one specific technology will transform all society, it's very naive about the potential of socio-technical systems, you know, in the everyday life of citizens and users and people around and a specific community. Also, is ignoring the lack of knowledge that people might have about the technology and the resistance that other people might do about the socio-technical system. And that, I think, is something that in El Salvador has been seen in the last month and a half, with a lot of resistance from rural areas, a lot of resistance from elderly users. Also creates dependence. And this is fascinating because El Salvador literally is spending large amounts of money to buy more Bitcoin, because, and every time that they does that, because they increase heavily the demand, the price goes down and the value of the cryptocurrency goes down on the country too. And that creates economical effects. But also they have like a strong reliance that the market of Bitcoin will be enough to satisfy all the economical needs that the country might have in their everyday life of the citizens and their visitors. And El Salvador is a very tiny country. Nevertheless, the dependence of like, with the not with other country, but with the network of the traders of Bitcoin in the world to have access to the adequate amounts that they need to run the country is particularly concerning. Two other technological shortcomings are the technological solutionism, that is assuming that the technology will like make these changes and bring with like Bitcoin like a silver bullet. There's like other multiple cryptocurrencies that have different protocols sometimes, or different principles, or different availabilities built in their technology that weren't considered by El Salvador, or if they were decided that no, because the Bitcoin results to be the most popular one. And decided Bitcoin was because the most popular one, the one that can solve and bring a cashless society, is highly problematic and exclude other possible solutions on that. And this is important in the way that in the last 3 years, the remesas, this is money that like people from their country send to their families in their home country, have been increasingly transferred using cryptocurrencies between North America and Central America. But that wasn't just crypto, Bitcoin, but also other kind of cryptocurrencies like Ethereum and other ones that have different price of trading and different access for the users. But the involvement of the state on that brings a very specific kind of solution and very specific kind of intervention that left apart the others. And finally, there is like a kind of privilege of exclusion. And in this case, El Salvador is a very low income country on Latin America. Doing this experiment is trying to overcome an economical exclusion that has been victim for like decades, but also it's restraining other countries to do similar things, because there's like a kind of like approach to get profit from the selling of Bitcoin in the future, as the country will like accumulate more and more Bitcoin to do their things. But the construction of exclusionary technologies, it's problematic because always there's like communities left apart. And in conclusion, some ongoing thinkings that or takeaways from this presentation. First, situate images of the future with local images of technology requires careful consideration of the assumption and the practices of future making that are producing those images. The second is visions of the future and images of technology. transform each other around agonistic, antagonic, and allosteric interactions. And that is in particular important because like help us to see that these two elements, despite coexist and always are together, they're interacting in different forms in different places. When we situate the visions of the future, the image of the situated image of technology start to interact in specific forms. And the third, the centering visions of the future refract the expectations of individuals with technological shortcomings who might experience it. It's like when we make those questions to the visions of the future, we will start to see what technological shortcomings we are reproducing, or what assumptions about the technical systems might make those visions not just unfeasible, but also undesirable. To conclude, a quote of Donna Haraway that inspires me a lot to think about the multiple visions that we are coexisting between futures and technology. And this is like single vision produced, worse illusion than double vision or many head monsters. And I hope that this help you to embrace the multiplicity of visions that we're surrounding between futures and technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was really inspiring. I mean, it was just a bunch of knowledge to send our way, and now we have to deal with that, right? So, I mean, it's really remarkable. Thank you so much. And I also got inspired myself, especially on the last part, right? So we probably need to talk a little bit more about that. I'm very excited about that. So now we have some time for Q&A. If anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand. Let me kick off while the rest is thinking about that question. There are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. I think the first thing that I noticed, and I was not prepared for this, but you talked about the disconnect between the introduction of technology and how people perceive it, or the ability of people to actually use it or capture the value of it, right? The idea of Bitcoin, however, was something different. Here, a system was introduced where the government itself was not prepared. It was they introduced the technology that was kind of a counterculture and embraced it as a centralized mechanism that they could use in their society. Is that something new? Are we going to see more of that? Or because we now, so most part of your presentation was about how the disconnect at the disconnect at the local level, so at the level where people operate. But now we're seeing a technology being introduced where the government is not even able to fully use it or fully comprehend all the functions of it. Is that something new? Have we seen that before? Is that?
I think this is the most common manifestation of emerging technologies on governments. And I think we tend to talk a lot on that, on like technology policy, that governments are really bad to regulate technologies because they don't understand it, and they need to like have like a time to understand what actually is going on. And I think that happens when the pseudonymous system is information. And that is, I think, also something that has been explored for some scholars in science and technology study, on organizational studies in particular. But in technology policy, it's common to see that governments are not prepared for emerging technologies. And there is like a set of strategies that some governments tend to use before doing these kind of like radical implementations, like El Salvador is doing in their financing system. But I will say, with this in particular, this will be not, I don't think this will be something to be replicated in the next year or two, but perhaps in 5 or 6 years, depending on first how the crypto market evolves. This year was like a kind of like good year for crypto, became popular. A lot of people is like discussing about cryptocurrencies around the world. And it's interesting because also blockchain in some way like start to dissipate despite these two technologies until like 1 year or year and a half were like deeply entangled because the protocols and the technology that like cryptocurrency work is actually blockchain, and these both work like born together from the same ideas. Nevertheless, I think what El Salvador is doing will be something that might be emulated for other countries if El Salvador is successful in 1 or 2 years. But until now, this law happened, like was passed in the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, was implemented in September. And now they have like almost 3 months, and it's still highly controversial because it's not that they replace fully the crypto with Bitcoins or national currency, but they mandate all the country to use as an equivalent. And in that way, the infrastructure of digital currencies implies that you have like digital devices that you can like make transactions with that, or also you can get like a card, but like, you need to have this electronic device that can like read the card and make the electronic transaction and register in the blockchain what is going on between the movement of the Bitcoins. But in addition to be like energy intensive and all that kind of things, right over the blockchain, there is this element about like, if your machine is not working, you can do that transaction because this needs to be in real time. That assumption about like have in El Salvador a national real-time connectivity is something that doesn't relate with the electrical and telecommunication capabilities that the country has today in 2021. That means that the future of a capitalist society in El Salvador is lost because it wasn't prepared? No, but this means that a lot of countries will see where mistakes are doing in El Salvador now to make this. Another thing that happens recently was like, there is just specific ATMs machines that are able to give you cash from crypto, and that conversion need to be in a very specific ATMs. And El Salvador just brought 200 of them to distribute around the country, and that happens in October because I think they have before 20. And in touristic areas, in high hotels, I mean, it's like democratized Bitcoin. It's not something that nobody was doing before. And El Salvador, for sure, did a decision without knowing what that means. And I think those kind of learnings that El Salvador is doing now will, for instance, make that states in the US that has considering this, like the New York State or California, might or no move forward in a few years with this policy. And if that happens, other countries might follow. But if the El Salvador experiment doesn't work because the Bitcoin cost crash or things like that, I don't think it's something that will be replicated.
Yeah, that would be a very expensive, since you're the guarantor as well as a state, that would be a very expensive exercise. But definitely something very interesting to follow up on. Farah has a question, Farah Najar Arvalo has a question. So how do you see the existing feminist movement in Latin America shaping visions of the future, given the rise of extreme right governments or leftist governments that do not engage fully with the movement?
I think the feminist movement is fundamental in Western Latin America. In the last 10 years, have like got a lot of like traction and affiliation and commitment. I think two things. It's important to identify that feminist movement and feminist or feminism, the multiple ones, and feminist scholars are different. And I think government has been recently in different countries, even right-wing governments, starting to embrace feminist scholarship in their work and their like task and their, but not feminist demands. Nevertheless, I think feminist movements have been deeply a radical and deep source of possible futures, asking about assumptions that or gendered societies have. Latin American is characterized by the patriarchy. It's not that the rest of the world is not patriarchal, but because there is like a strong feminist movement in the present, that patriarchy is more threatened publicly than in other areas in the world. And I think that has to do a lot with the system thinking about the gender dynamics, and sometimes about the future, but not always. And I think that is interesting to consider. I think other social movements in the region that are large, like the environmentalist movement, have been more effective creating visions of the future and embracing action in the present than the feminist movement in the region. That doesn't put apart that the feminist movement had pushed a lot of changes in recent years. But I think a feminist perspective of the future is something that even with woman writers or with woman futurists is rare to hear. That doesn't mean that they are not embracing feminist values or feminist commitment or feminist practices. But a part of this feminist, the different waves of feminism is make explicit these kind of things. And I think there are, I think there are tools that about future making and future envisioning that are during this year and the last year, the pandemic year, starting to be more democratized in Latin America. That might empower that in the next year or in 2 more years or in 5 more years, we will see specific Latin American feminist visions of the future. But I think Latin America is in a stage that the future as conversation is something that still came from outside. The future is happening in other places and not in Latin America, and making the future and protecting the future is something that is a way more like contained to what means to happen after the pandemic, or what means to happen like with climate change in a very specific way. Yeah. Hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Jonathan Lemos from Colombia. Hi, Jonathan. Great. Thank you for being here. Asked the question, how can we help to foster encouraging visions of the future here in Latin America? And Jonathan, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything to that. Thank you so much for the question.
Thanks, Jonathan, for the question. I think there is like 4 things that I think are important, but also is part of like literally the work I'm doing during this month. I'm looking who are like producing the visions of the future in the region. I'm talking with some science fiction writers, with speculative designers, with professional futurists that I have found, as well with some government official working in strategies. And in all these groups, I think futures is still a space of like reduced expertise. And despite people talk about the future everyday life, I think the effort to make future a domestic or mundane conversation is something that it's happening, but not fast enough. I think since last year, there is more articulation in Latin America between different communities, working on how they are connecting with each other. And there's like a interesting podcast from Chile that is like interviewing and putting in contact people from all around the region to talk about how they do futures and how they think about the different projects on future. There was a conference, that was the first one, the Association of Professional Futurists, that happens online on late October, that was looking to reach out college students, undergrad students mostly, to talk about images of like futures that they can produce. And I think the first thing to do is foster the articulation of the different communities of future produce or future making on the region. I think the second one is give visibility to these communities, because first they need to know each other, and second, like make a kind of like where you go with this. And for instance, connecting with Farah's question, there is some feminist futurists, but they're not part of the network or the conversation or things like that. Give visibility to the flavors of like the future practices that happens is particularly important. I think the third one is contesting futures that are extremely dangerous. And I think there is like a lot of archetypes of the future that tend to be like highly utopic or highly dystopic, that disengage people, because the utopias and dystopias are like kind of like futures extremes, because they strip away the agency of the people to think about the future. And when we think about this like catastrophic climate change that will destroy the world tomorrow, you don't have so much to do, and then like you get like disengaged with that. And if you say like, no, this town will disappear in the next 10 years, like move, it's like, yeah, but also like Amsterdam was supposed to disappear centuries ago, and look that huge dams that they have to like contain the water. And this is not to say, oh, the dams will solve everything, but human ingenious coordination and capabilities have created things that weren't possible by themselves. And I think that, I will say, this is the theater thing, start to like fight back images of the future that are being reproduced. And the fourth one, and I think this one is like, I think was my particular commitment, strongly commit to find local futures. And because I think Latin America has structural Asian futures that we import futures from other places. And I have another presentation, and I have part of ideas that I have actually worked since 2018 with Farah and with Yamar and with other people. That is the idea of anti-futures, that there is like images of the future that Latin America says that are futures that actually are present in Japan, in the US, and are not the future of anybody. Are the present, are happening, are doable. If you put the money, that things happen. The problem is like, for the structural inequality of Latin America, we don't have those present. And that is not a problem with the futures that might happen. It's a problem with the inequality that Latin America has in the present that we need to fight. And to avoid anti-futures, we need to like deeply commit to find what images of the future are deeply rooted on the needs of their communities. And fighting images of the future that says like, oh, this might be helpful, like this might be work if like we do like insert here something like Finland education, because Finland education is fantastic and good for Finland, not for Colombia, not for Panama, not for Argentina. And I think that dependence thinking, that actually the same people that talk about pluriverse, talk about the concept of coloniality of power, is a manifestation of coloniality. And that coloniality of thinking, it's deeply rooted on the future. I mean, well, the future is connected with that coloniality of thinking. We, Latin America as region, and Latin American identity as like societal, historical, and cultural identity, will be undermined by other cultures, other communities, other people that is striving with their local images of the future. And I will say there is like fascinating examples in Southeast Asia as well, on Russia and like Eastern Europe, that are like places also with economical constraints that are having their own visions of the future, and they're like doing it and empowering and like trying to avoid being determined for other places. And also there's like radical examples on the Arabic Gulf and like other places. And I think Latin America is not, most of Latin American governments and communities and scholars are not doing that, if not are in conversation with these like globalizing futures and not looking in the local futures that they can do. And I think that relationship of dependence between futures is the one that also we need to like fight and say like, wait, this actually can be done different if we hear the people here, or if we read the scholars in here, or if we embrace the knowledge that we have in here, instead of like bringing the future from other places.
Martin, can you go a little bit deeper into that? So the scholar Akili Mbembe talks about how marginalized people in communities are always trying to survive. So they're always in a mode of survival, right? So how do you think then about the future? Like, I have to survive because, you know, I have to survive, so I have to work. I have to. You're constantly thinking about the now. Is therefore the idea of like future imagination, is that still very elitist, even if we go and I know you thought about this. I know you have the answer. I know you have explored this. Could you talk a little bit more about how then do we look in country at the different the different class systems they have and the struggles that are going on?
This, I think, thank you for the question. I think this connects deeply with like the question about inequality and future making. I think because future making until now, and I think as other professions, requires a high level, not just of knowledge to make it, but also requires a very specific set of time to make these reflections that like a lot of people that live on the wage on the day is unable to have. And I think if you can pay the time of that people, you can give them the possibility to participate in the constructions of futures. And I think that is something that like is not common in Latin America for different reasons, but also creating those spaces on their communities. And that means like, for instance, go where the people is at, go to the soccer club, go to the mothers center. That are actually institutions that are common in Latin America, are very frequent to find. You find like working class men meeting on Saturdays or Sundays to play their soccer game, etc., etc., and bring these kind of conversations when they're like drinking their beer or having or the ladies of the community having the conversation with the tea, and turn those spaces on spaces to reflect on the future with the help of mediators. It's I think a very particular thing that I have seen very little. But that is how you can like bring this like or enact, because it's not, you're not bringing the capability. The people have the capability by themselves, but you can enact these capabilities of the people going and meeting the people where they are. I think as any academic endeavor, future thinking has an element of like elitist, because the people that like we get paid to do research, we have time to do this kind of conversations, but like how we empower with this to those people that doesn't have the time, it's like finding spaces in their everyday routines that you can like enact this, and this can turn like in getting their opinion or their view in one specific topic with 15 minutes exercise, or visiting their offices, or like doing this kind of like granular intervention. And I have seen, for instance, in Chile with the constitutional process, that granular work was able to reach a lot of people, and it's reaching a lot of people because they're literally going to talk with them in their labor and their work, in their like creating like dinners to make this. And I think those kind we tend to envision that we need to like make specials academic times or like professional times to work in this kind of things, but sometimes in particular with people that like has a lot of knowledge that tend to be neglected because we not hear it never. We need to meet the people where they are and create alternative and strategies that will connect with their will connect their knowledge and needs with the projects or futures that we might have.
Right. Thank you so much, Martin, for answering this question. The Gershon Dagba, excuse me if I mispronounce it, but Gershon Dagba is asking a question about El Salvador. What do you think can be done to improve the digital literacy among the citizens of El Salvador? And this question would apply for other developing countries in general. I think it's an excellent question, something that you mentioned but didn't further elaborate.
Yeah. Also has been previously worked a little in another project with like digital literacies. I consider digital literacy as a skill, that like requires to be offered not just for like typically it's like, well, let's train the kids in the schools. But that digital literacy need to be, I think, first well defined by the country. There's like multiple definitions about the capabilities that you can do. It's not just like using like an ofimatic software, or like be able to turn on and off your computer. It's also to interact with like tablets and devices now. It's also able to requires to like understand the basic of video editing to relate with like YouTube and other sources, etc. And I think those kind of skill set need to be constantly reviewed by the country and create a kind of like task force to in particular work with the communities that are more in need to access to this knowledge now. And a difference to what we tend to think that like, let's go and work with the kids in digital literacy, that I think schools are doing a generally good job in Latin America to empower people and give access and like ensure that like people even in rural areas and people with like very poor students that don't have access with their families to a digital device to have access to devices. I think something that happens in the 90s but disappeared for different reasons was to have like public cyber cafes that has like trainings for like worker women and people in the working class and people in fabrics, people and elderly people. And I think now like there is also to remeasure a lot digital literacy in Latin America after the pandemic, because a lot of people got trained by their families or their communities with the pandemic when everybody was like interacting remotely. But also that also requires to enhance our standards about like what digital literacy, what actions a digital literacy currently entails to understand where are the gaps. But like interacting with like a cryptocurrency app is a very deep level skill. If you have struggles to operate like a cell phone camera or like to open, to manage your passwords or things like that. And in that way, having those like basic skills, understand and assess it, I think is the first thing. And the second is create task force that goes to those communities that has more struggles. And I think those communities that has more struggles are usually the communities that has less infrastructure of connectivity. And I think that is a good marker to say what communities you can work more closely. And in some way, you need to grow your infrastructure, meanwhile you grow your know-how of digital literacy on those communities. Yeah.
So Puja Chitri has a question about the importance of mediators, and you touched upon that in your previous answer a little bit. So what is the importance of mediators to reconcile the antagonistic vision of the future and reality? And what do you think what do you think? How do you think mediators can play a role in that?
I think mediators plays a fantastic role in a lot of things, but we tend to neglect it because our mediators and like mediators have like this like need to disappear of our view. But I think mediators are professionals that usually are like young professionals that are full of ideas, but also with the need of like exchange and how mediators can reconcile the antagonistic effects of visions of the future and visions of technology. And I think it's not the role of mediators to like reconciliate, I will say, those elements, but also, but instead is to situate the limits of the visions of technology inside the visions of the future. It means like we can create the visions of the future, we can do participative exercise, we can mediate between communities and decision makers to have common visions of the future and like have a set of alternatives that that are desirable. But those antagonistic effects need to be like marker. And I think the mediators are the people that like will carry a little more knowledge on their communities than the participants or the decision makers about the specific things. And the work of the mediators is on like dissect these images of the future in a way that say like this one has this like kind of like antagonistic effects that are like we are failing here. Like the digital literacy for El Salvador is like a thing that is affecting that. And I think who can play role of mediators? I think a lot of people with like college training can play the role of mediator if they're engaged deeply on participatory work, if they engage in topics that are really passionate, but they approach a little with like future literacy frameworks and devices. And I think something that happens during 2020 in the future thinking community globally is like a lot of toolkits appears and became public and free. And there's like a lot of ways to like go and participate with people and create futures or visions of the future for different things. But I think the analysis of those visions that are produced is the thing that the mediators are not prepared to do, in particular the technological analysis. And that is what first I'm trying to dissect and like create methods for that. But second, there is like a work to themselves to recognize what things might work wrong with this vision of the future in my community, or what the vision of the future in my country. And those questions are questions that like people in science and technology study is particularly suitable for, but like somebody that got a course on that might be a fantastic mediator, even if they're engineers or designers or physicians working in the future of healthcare, and they want to like understand that, like given this time of analysis and not just the time of production of the visions of the future, it's important to recognize the technological shortcomings